Welcome back. Now, last Friday night, while many of you were enjoying the opening overs of a weekend, Juventus were hit with a 15-point deduction in Serie A, casting them from the Champions League places to 10th after this weekend's round of fixtures. To look into how this came about and what possibly could come next for them, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Italian journalist Daniele Fisichella. Daniele, welcome to the show.
Hi, Rich.
I'm quite conscious that this is a pretty complex case. Feel free to take us back as far back as you need to in the genesis of this and how Juventus have found themselves suddenly in mid-table in Serie A.
There have been a few investigations since the last 18 months in Italy. There have been criminal and civil investigations. And eventually, 3 days ago on Friday, the Italian FA, had a verdict on an investigation on the so-called plusvalenze, which in Italy means artificial gains. These are artificial gains that are generated by player swaps, where players are swapped at a value that is not representative by the true value. Juventus have been found guilty of doing this systematically, and by doing that, they were able to inflate their balancing books, to balance their books out. For example, the most famous case is the case of the swap between Pjanic and Artur Melo with Barcelona. Now, with valuing Pjanic when he went to Barcelona around 70 million euros, which was not his true value, Juventus were able to write that value off from their balancing books and obviously make it look much more healthy. But there are other swaps that seemed very suspect to the investigators. For example, the ones that involved young players that Juventus swapped with teams from the French league, from Ligue 2 or the third division, which players we never heard of since, and obviously they were valued 8-9 millions, a lot of money. But not only that. So in April last year, the federation found Juventus not guilty of this crime because they couldn't establish a real market value for players, so it was impossible for them to understand whether those values had been inflated or not. But now, since then, a new criminal investigation started. New proofs have been added, in particular the phone tapping, that the phone recordings where there are the hierarchy of Juventus, the former sporting director Fabio Paratici, now at Tottenham, Gianni Agnelli, Pavel Nedved, Cherubini, the current sporting director, talking about this system and explaining at length how they were tricking the system, if you like, and also some of them expressing their worries that they were trying to do even too much. Now, because of these new revelations, the FA reopened the investigation and convicted Juventus, deducted Juventus 15 points. But as far as we know, this is only the second degree of judgment. Juventus will obviously appeal this first decision, but there might be much more to come. We think it might just be the tip of the iceberg, not only for Juventus, but also for other Italian clubs.
That was what I was going to get to, Daniele, because this initially didn't just involve Juventus. I believe were there 9 other Italian clubs that were implicated in this initially anyway?
Yes, initially there were 9 clubs. There was Napoli as well. The plusvalenza artificial gain of Osimhen was under the scrutiny. It was Genoa, it was Sampdoria, and other teams that currently are in Serie B or Serie C, second or third division. The strange thing is that only Juventus at the moment have been convicted, have been deducted points. Everyone else has been acquitted. And obviously what Juventus fans say, how come we did dealings with other teams but we are guilty and they are not guilty? They only been given a small fine. So this is going to be one of the line of defenses of Juventus. But the reason is Juventus were convicted because they were the architect of the system. And if you like, the investigators found the smoking gun. The phone recordings are very, very clear. There is no doubt about that Juventus are guilty, were guilty, and inflated their financial situations by illegal proceedings. Now, possibly other teams are going to be involved in that. I know that the prosecutors are now re-examining the cases of the likes of Sassuolo, the likes of Sampdoria, the likes of Empoli, which are the teams in Serie A that had more close links with Juventus. And so this investigation will probably expand. And I tend to believe that this is going to be, again, the line of defense of Juventus when they will appeal the first conviction in 10 days' time. They will say, we were not the only one. So they will try, obviously, to involve as many teams as possible and to produce perhaps the biggest earthquake in Italian football we've ever seen. And then we'll see whether the points deducted will remain 15. By the way, the points that were deducted, 15, were more than what the prosecutor initially asked. So it's an extraordinary decision. The prosecutor asked only for 9 points, but we'll see whether they're going to be deducted, whether we're going to stay, or other teams are going to get the points deducted. At the moment, looking at the Serie A standings, it's purely artificial because everything could change really in a matter of few months.
There's a few strands there that I want to tease out. Why is it that the prosecutor only suggested a 9-point deduction, and yet on Friday night Juve ended up with a 15-point deduction? Why was there that discrepancy?
Because Juventus were found guilty of breaching the Article 4 of the Italian FA, which is the one that is related to the loyalty and to operating loyally towards the competition, is considering a serious breach of the code of conduct of the teams, and they were added those 6 points deduction on top of the 9 already requested. Also, the prosecutor wanted to inflict Juventus a deduction that would effectively take them away from Europe next season. So they wanted to be sure that Juventus were not able to participate in any European competition next season. And in fact, they dropped down to the 10th place in the table. Even Europa League, Conference League at the moment looks a bit far away. Because obviously for a team of the caliber of Juventus, being able to participate to the Champions League is a massive revenue boost. But again, the prosecutor thinks that by inflating their balancing books, by obviously the financial misgiving, they gain an artificial advantage over the competitions in Europe as well.
Daniele, Juve are listed on the stock exchange in Italy. Am I right in saying that? Is that
yes.
Is that a lot of the reason why the courts have been so vociferous in going after them and making sure there is a prosecution behind Juve, and not necessarily being as staunch with the other clubs that are involved in this investigation?
It is also a reason. There is obviously a public liability, public responsibility for Juventus being in the stock exchange. And this is one of the reasons why perhaps the prosecution has been so harsh, but also because of the extent of the artificial gains. I mean, we are looking at a range of over 60 operation transfers across the whole Serie A in Europe, and Juventus were involved in 42 of them. Now, Juventus believes that this is just a small percentage of their annual turnover, that these operations were not actually anything fraudulent, or they were not obviously wrong, but it will be very hard to demonstrate that. We also have to remember that this is the decision of the sporting justice. Parallel to this, there is another trial, which is going to be the criminal trial, where Agnelli, Paratici, Nedved are going to be involved. This is going to start in March. It could leave consequences for the criminal record, for example, of Fabio Paratici, who's now been banned for 30 months from taking any office in Italian football. It doesn't extend to Europe, but obviously UEFA is monitoring that. So there are two parallel investigations, and the beauty or the tragic things of the Italian justice system is that the sporting justice and the criminal justice, they don't go parallel. They go at different pace. That's why we have a sporting conviction way before the criminal trial has even begun.
And there's also an element that the Italian Olympic Committee could get involved in this as well, because they are the ultimate arbiters of sporting decision in the country.
That's correct, and that's where Juventus are going to appeal. Now, we need to wait a couple of days more, maybe 3-4 days, to read the motivations between the 15 points being deducted. That's going to be key, because based on the motivation, we will know more about it, and we will know how Juventus are going to defend themselves in front of CONI, the Olympic Committee. But apparently, they're going to have two main arguments to defend themselves. First of all, they believe that there were some procedural mistakes in the way the FA has reopened the investigations. So the paperwork were presented late, as simple as that, and that would invalidate the conviction. And also the thing that there are other phone recordings where actually Juventus managements deny any wrongdoing, and they reassure themselves that everything they're doing is legal, so that they're not being considered by investigators. So they think the investigation was partial and was also in a wrong time frame. Now, the Olympic Committee, and this is really important, cannot overturn the conviction. It can only reject the conviction and send it back to the Federal Court of Appeal. So obviously, after Juventus presents the appeal, we will not have the points deducted, but there might be, again, another federal trial. In the meantime, of course, the criminal trial would have started, but eventually Juventus can also go to an administrative arbitrate, which in Italy is called TAR del Lazio, which manages all, is an overarching body, but they can even go to the High Council of State. So there are many, many steps that Juventus can still take. Obviously depends whether they can do it on time by the end of the season or not.
Daniele, this is probably a dumb question on my behalf. Who was tapping the Juventus phones, and what was their reasoning behind that? And will Juve have any recourse behind that as well? Will they be able to say, listen, our lines were tapped illegally, we didn't know that we were under investigation? Is there an escape for them on that route?
No, I don't think Juventus can say that, because the phone tappings and the phone recordings comes on the back of the first investigations that was launched by after the Consumer Association in Italy is called Consob. They started raising some doubts. So obviously Juventus didn't know the phones were tapped, but it's been done within the legal framework of the justice system in that case.
This obviously has knock-on implications for the people directly involved. As you mentioned, there are bans handed down associated with this for Agnelli, for Pavel Nedved, who is obviously one of the directors of the club too, and Fabio Paratici, who's currently the sporting director, or a similar position at Tottenham. Have the FIGC, the Italian Federation, made any kind of petition to have Paratici's ban imposed outside of Italy?
They haven't done it yet, but probably this could come after the criminal trial. If Paratici is found guilty in the criminal trial, then there are much serious consequences, because then he would have collected two convictions, and the English FA could, of course, take action itself. UEFA could take action itself. At the moment, UEFA is being kept informed, is monitoring. But, in the UK, in England, if you have a criminal record, you cannot take certain offices. Now, being the sporting director of a football club, which also obviously has got members, etc., probably is one of those. I'm not certain, but Spurs will be put in a very difficult situation. Of course, yes, Paratici is the one more at risk, but let's not forget the other ones as well. I mean, Andrea Agnelli is being banned for over 2 years, and he still is the architect of the European Super League. His credibility has been completely tarnished, put in pieces, and then obviously any kind of public office he will have after that will be definitely under serious scrutiny. This
isn't disastrous not only for Juventus. This is pretty dire for Serie A as a whole, notwithstanding the potential deductions or fines or bans that could come the way of other clubs. But the general attitude towards Serie A, within and without Italy, how it's perceived, how rights deals are done, how much the league is valued, this is all going to take a massive hit, you'd imagine, given what's happened here.
It's very sad, because when you see a standing with a team with an asterisk next to his name, minus something at the bottom of the standing, that means something wrong must have happened. And you understand that obviously the results on the pitch are not representative of the true value of what you see on the standings, and the chances of competing for the title. Well, look, Juventus were 10 points behind Napoli before these points got deducted. They were thrashed by Napoli 5-1, but they were on course to finish within the top four. I think they would have finished in the top four without being a spectacular season for them, any stretch of imagination. But it's a sad day for Italy, because I think it represents one of the big problems of Italian football during these years. The lack of resources. There's been no money. There's been no creativity also to find new talents from abroad, to bring young players in. And so even a big team like Juventus, who did all in with Ronaldo, they wanted to win the Champions League so desperately. They invested so much money. They got it wrong. They overpaid Ronaldo. Yes, of course, they win 3 titles with him. They overpaid Ramsey. Perhaps they are overpaying Rabiot. They forgot perhaps what they were about, and they got themselves into this mess because of lack of money, lack of creativity, lack of ideas as well. And is really true representative of the dire state of Italian football. Now, not every team has done that, but it tells you how less competitive Italian teams have been in the last few seasons. And we saw it that in Europe as well. They need to try and be more creative. If you can't purchase the best players in the world, you need to make your own talent or scout somewhere else, as other teams do in Europe and do really well in the Champions League. But also, I think it shows a bad attitude from Juventus, maybe having this sense of being above the law, of being invincible, of being... they could have done everything, really. And this is something that is going to go down badly. It has gone down badly within the same Juventus supporters, who say, we have been unjustly punished, but our conduct, it was awful. It was appalling. These managers we had, they were the worst we ever had in our history, and their name should be cancelled from a history. So there are two opposite rationales there. Of course, Juventus fans want to see justice in the sense that they want to see other teams to be punished as much as they are, but no doubt about it, they know they are guilty. And this is goes deep down into the roots of what Juventus have been and how they have behaved in the last few years, all for that mirage, for that illusion of winning the Champions League. They definitely chose the wrong way.
I'd imagine there's very little sympathy for Juventus, particularly given the fact that the Calciopoli scandal is still very much fresh in a lot of people's minds. I mean, that era of 2006 and when Juve were relegated, all on the back of, again, impropriety on their part as a club. Why? It's probably a reductive question. Why is it always them?
Well, Juventus are the biggest club in Italy with most supporters, but at the other side of the coin also are the most hated in sporting terms. I mentioned before about this sense of being above the law. Juventus in the years they have been guilty of that, and when it comes to Calciopoli, that's a real example of going above the law, doing everything possible to achieve the results. But the tragic thing is that with Calciopoli back in 2006, Juventus had such a strong team. They didn't need to do match fixing. They didn't need to control the referees. They would have won the games anyway. And with Calciopoli, they shot themselves on the foot. Again, Juventus fans, they think they were innocent back then with the Calciopoli scandal. With this one, Juventus fans, they know they are guilty. And then the aspect we need to consider is that this time around, Juventus needed to make their finances look healthier in order to be competitive. And they haven't managed. They haven't succeeded to do that. They haven't won in the Scudetto in the last 2 years. And the Champions League campaigns have been disastrous. So again, it's it's a really sad state of affair. And hopefully for Juventus, this could be the reset moment as they went down to Serie B in 2007 and start all over again and find again the values that they are about. Is not victory at all cost, but is about loyalty as well and being fair. Juventus have been extremely successful across the 70s, 80s, 90s because they had the anger, the fight, the guile, the strong Italian spirit as well in the team, which they seem to have lost somehow, and to make space for creative finance. But of course, they were guilty of this.
Is there any road back to football or to wider public society for people like Andrea Agnelli and Pavel Nedved after this?
It's very difficult to imagine that there's going to be a way back in football. Agnelli has been the president of Juventus for 10 years. His 10 years tenure has been successful. He's won 9 titles, many cups, no Champions League, but yet a very successful presidency. I don't think he can really come back to Juventus now after that, because ultimately he hasn't delivered on his big gamble, which was winning the Champions League. The team played 2 finals, come close to win. I think the one in 2015 against Real Madrid, although they lost 4-1, but they were a close team, a very close match to Real Madrid. But yeah, he basically didn't deliver on that, even with Ronaldo, with the best player on the world at that time. Nedved has been unsuccessful. As much as his Juventus career as a player has been great, and he was regarded as one of the best players across the 2000s for Juventus. As a manager, he's been unsuccessful. He hasn't left a mark. Some people wonder what his role actually was. Surely he's not been able to transmit the passion, the fury, the motivation that he had as a player to the managers or to the players that now play for Juventus.
What's your instinct, finally, Daniele, on how other teams or indeed Juventus might be further punished? Is it very likely in your estimation, or is it kind of this might be the extent of it?
Look, I think the punishment, this first punishment that we saw for Juventus might well be reduced, because I think 15 points, considering the initial request of the prosecutor, seems a very harsh punishment, especially if Juventus can demonstrate that they were not the only one doing wrong. However, there are other line of inquiries that the FA is considering at the moment, and there is one that is particularly important, is about the delayed payments of wages and the way Juventus spread the payment of wages for some players across the month and then didn't account for them. There is also the famous 19 millions that Ronaldo still owns. Now, if they've been found guilty of that as well, that will put in doubt whether Juventus could legally inscribe themselves to the Serie A. They had really their legal requirements. That could be a punishment even more severe, and perhaps could even involve relegation to Serie B or maybe Serie C. But again, we'll have to wait and see. I think this is the tip of the iceberg. But for this particular plusvalence case, I think that the punishment will eventually be reduced, but I think the worst is yet to come for you.
And for other clubs?
For the others, there could be something. Again, we know that there are teams like Sassuolo, Sampdoria, that had a lot of Genoa as well, that made a lot of swaps with Juventus in the last 3-4 years. Depends how this new investigation is reopened, but I believe Juventus legal team will want to involve them. Look, when he was in Calciopoli, Juventus were the most punished because they were relegated to Serie B, but there were punishment for Napoli, for Fiorentina, for Lazio, and they were in the region of 10 points, 12 points. They all struggled the following season. I think the punishment, they will be proportionate to the objectives of the team in Serie A. So, for example, if Sampdoria is punished, a punishment of 5 points will be enough now to see them relegated and probably to cut any chances of them competing for salvation. If it goes to Empoli, it could be 6-7 points as well. I think, again, it depends how much value, how much the team size and the team's objectives are taken into account. Of course, if you take 3 points away from Juventus, they basically feel almost unscattered. They can make them up straight away.
Yeah. Daniele, I have a feeling we will be talking to you about this again sometime in the future, and probably very soon too, probably as soon as March. But for now, thank you so much for guiding us through that minefield of investigations behind Juventus and the other teams.
Thank you very much. Speak soon.